Theory of everything. Legacy. Tradition and innovation in Planescape 5e. Hello there. Last time we've officially seen Sigil and the Outlands in proper detail was almost 30 years ago. Planescape was a unique setting of battling philosophies, and it was fundamental to many concepts of Dungeons & Dragons Multiverse that became its dogmas. It was instrumental to forge its legacy. In short, Planescape was and is about questions. So you and I today will question everything. 3 questions to begin with. Why should you listen to me at all? Name's Mikhail. I'm a Crimean storyteller who studied Planescape academically. My university diploma was about the style and the visual language of that setting. Throughout the years, I've read almost every canonical Planescape source, from box sets and adventures to Dragon Magazine's sidebar notes and almost canonized fanfiction. I know my planes. Why are you recording this now? We're on the brink of exploring new rendition of a solidified piece of D&D canon. With Spelljammer and Dragonlance behind their back, it won't be the first time Wizards are bringing back something conceptualized in a TSR era, but it will be the first time we're going to have massive ramifications on magic system and world building side of the narrative. So what? TTRPG community has power, social, economical, and for some of us, almost spiritual. Public opinion shifts, dominant narratives change. But in a time when artistic media franchises can live up to half a century, there is no better moment to reflect on legacy of communal storytelling. We are the ones who helped forge it. And here is another disclaimer. This video was supposed to be a small preview of 12 poster artworks from the faction teaser, but then I've realized that making a point about Planescape without context and clear argumentation is worthless. I would try to keep this video D&D beginner friendly, but be warned that the amount of references to source material from previous editions might be overpowering. Let's try and use this video to talk about 3 things simultaneously: 12 faction illustrations, my views on previous 5e releases, and legacy in art. How we play defines what we feel. Culture is an ever-shifting entity that forms us just like we form it ourselves. How does modern culture influences our gaming habits and product lines? As far as we can see, culture can be a mix of ideologies, beliefs, natural and social resources, food recipes, places and times. To a person who experiences a regular day with 2-hour-long commute, 8 hours of work, and then endless side jobs due to a soul-crushing student loans, a lifestyle in 2020s leaves a small sliver of free time. It is the reason why so many friends of mine exclusively play one-shots or can allow themselves to relax at the gaming table at a convention a couple of times a year. Faster speed of life, combined with a harsher economic landscape, forces many of us to become game developers, to co-modify our hobbies into businesses, to support our gaming habits without feeling irresponsible. But that wasn't always the case, right? In eras of previous editions, though, game designers were happily preparing us to embark on an epic journey to play a massive story arc across multiple character levels and probably real-life years. To do that, you were able to pick up dozens of books that provided details on geography, mechanics, bloodlines, or arcane secrets of a specific setting. Usually, the more books for a setting there were published, the more notorious that setting became. Product, language, culture, and marketing all were building up a type of play that felt more like a lifestyle, with a constant meetup schedule and campaigns with a proper novel-like plot. Or for the less fortunate, just a never-ending pain of gathering your party before venturing forth. It placed a great responsibility on GMs, as this ecosystem of play relied heavily on a vast trove of almost encyclopedic knowledge about a particular setting that storytellers were supposed to gather across multiple source books, with many questions on how does this fantastic world works. DSR and later Wizards were forced to spell out their answers in a form of a book or a box set. In its time, Planescape was able to answer more questions about D&D Multiverse than the majority of concurrent players were actually interested to ask. The setting was a complex, semi-balanced narrative tapestry of a very unique but very specific rules, a wild post-modern construct where real-world religious pantheons stood side by side with in-canon deities, mixed with philosophical schools in a giant conspiracy board formed to serve the Gygaxian alignment system. It patched and amended previous lore, provided bridges and ways to logically interweave storylines of pre-established game worlds into one great meta system. To grasp the sheer vastness of lore and implement it in-game, you are supposed to read through a primary set of books with general rules applicable to the whole multiverse, and later build up expanded lore on top of a functioning theoretical base. A truly genius way to approach a task of academic magnitude. And it is quite easy to see how this sheer amount of lore information that has nothing to do with practical side of playing the game can be an impossible entrance barrier to start playing D&D 20 years ago. Partially, this book-bloat economic model was responsible for growing hobby elitism and the demise of TSR. With 3 editions after the second, it's evident that a brilliant narrative concept of points of light introduced by 4th edition was captivating, but inherently antithetical for Dungeons & Dragons pedigree. Community could accept or reject dynamic and innovative combat mechanics, but the need for continuity was made evident by edition's general reception. Just like their predecessors, modern D&D hobbyists prefer action-packed, cinematic adventures with a monster of the week mentality. But for almost a decade, they vocally expressed their disinterest in the alignment system and original ancient lore that was written when some of them weren't even alive yet. With a player base that has a painfully limited amount of time on their hands, the demand for vast, long-term projects and continuity was minimal, and most of us are able to partake in such a story by watching along the adventures of professional TTRPG streamers. Unfortunately, even established settings with substantial fan bases like Ravenloft or Eberron got only a couple of new books in 5e, relying on legacy and third-party content and not helping with the movement of the overarching D&D story forward. Notable exception is Ed Greenwood's Forgotten Realms, the main stage for 5th edition adventures. But let's be honest, who even needs a global meta-plot story when main events are happening at your own table, right? Legacy of the past editions can collect dust for all we care. What matters happens right now. Well, I am not entirely sure about that. You see, judging by the cold calculations, D&D is an empire. And I'm not talking only about just manufacturing scale or generated revenue. Its cultural impact is so vast, folks tend to overlook that modern generic fantasy genre looks, talks, and works because of the work Gygax, Aronson, Greenwood, Hickman, Scrub, Cook, and of course Cook, Macomb, Barr, Donovan, Reynolds, Cordell, Vallis, and many others done in their days at the helm. If you were a fan of Joss Whedon's Buffy the Vampire Slayer in the 90s, or you're a fan of Patrick Rothfuss's Kingkiller Chronicle, or if you're exploring the ultimate vastness of Brendan Sanderson's Cosmere, their secret sauce and their inspiration at some point of their artistic journey was D&D. From power scaling and narrative beats to surprise plot twists and captivating characters, these tabletop role-playing game inspired generations of creative minds throughout its 50 years of existence. While some of its glory might be lost to time, cultural shifts, and intellectual property disputes, let's try and figure out what happens when you step inside your own narrative footprint. We begin by taking a look at the first new piece of Planescape 5e content we have on hand. Faction posters. They're proudly displaying fascinating artistic renditions of characters from Planescape setting. They are diverse to an extreme, some colorful, some bleak, some use mundane materials while others dressed in magically reinforced garments, in comparison to 2nd edition illustrations by Tony DiTerlisi. This gang feels too saturated, and some definitely miss old Planescape's rusty charm. Changes in artistic medium and overall quite different art direction caters to a younger crowd. It is a bit strange not to see classic planar ancestries like Variar or Gith among them, but overall, folks look spry and ready for action. With Tieflings and Osimor since 2nd edition becoming a mainstream choice instead of mechanically loaded complications, everyone else looks like they're just in the right place. In times of the original Planescape, factions were philosophical communities with actual functions within the sigil, City of Doors. Hardheads patrolled the streets, governors held the court, while dusters tended to the dead, and so on. Each faction was led by a factal, an entity in charge that decided the faction's agenda in the streets and multiverse in general. It was known that factals rise and fall, and the Lady of Bane, enigmatic ruler of Sigil, is watching over their Craigstans, a mix of philosophical, political, and martial competition for power and influence. The 2nd edition Planescape publication history stretched from 1994 to 1998, with 6 box sets, 12 accessories, and 12 adventures. Altogether, They were telling many captivating stories from different corners of the multiverse, which concluded in a crescendo of faction war. It was an adventure that detailed an epic conflict and great conspiracy that resulted in several canonical deaths of different factals and later fracturing, merger, dissolvent or outright banishment of particular factions from Sigil. As we can see, 3rd and 4th edition content corroborated that narrative with factions in exile and City of Doors clear from their influence. Judging by the Forgotten Realms calendar, it's been about 123 years since the canonical date of the faction war and to the common present date of 5th edition. Well, let's take a look at faction insignias. Some of them look almost identical to their predecessors, while others have changed completely. We can see new symbol of Athar, and it's easy to see how cosmic and very new astral they've become. While 2nd edition Astral was still a graveyard of the gods and the theater curtains of the multiverse, it's nice to see how their visual style represents a major cosmological shift. The other odd-looking sign would be the Hands of Havoc one. Judging by the brief text introduction, this new faction represents a merger between Chaos Adepts and Free League, and maybe Revolutionary League as well in the new formation. As you can see, its visual style is rather different from classic insignias, but detailed enough not to be a simple mark of unruly vandals. Final semi-new addition would be the Mind's Eye, which in canon formed after unification of the Godsmen and the Sign of One factions. Their insignia looks like a classic icon of Godsmen, with a little more eye detail for thematic emphasis. As we can evidently see in the posters, with 2 newcomer exceptions, factions in 5e are led by entities with the exactly same names as factals had around 123 years ago? In some cases it's quite natural due to supernatural origins of some of them, but in some cases it would be plausible if the faction would be now led by a spouse or a descendant named after a historical figure. At the end of the faction war, those factals who weren't assassinated or became casualties of a citywide infighting were placed in the mazes, extra-dimensional pocket realities created by the Lady of Pain as both timeless prisons, great puzzles, and test of character, for every maze of the past had a way to escape it. As far as planar logic goes, names we see today on those posters can be in fact factals of the old under a peculiar amnesty program. With a multiversal glitch mentioned before by developers, we can expect that some factals are in fact alternate reality versions of themselves from the past. That would mean that their personalities, politics, and even how they present themselves will differ from the classic Planescape. We're already encountered potential similar changes with Domain Lords in Van Richten Guide to Ravenloft, where some ancient characters like Falkovnia's Lord Vlad Drakov, who was replaced by Lady Vladeshka Drakov, or Lamordia's Victor Moldenheim, who became Victra instead. But today's release changed my initial assumption. And obviously, that raises new questions. Amongst them, how can you as a storyteller approach a concept of continuity with a story in which nothing has any ramifications? Decision to reuse or return old factals reinforces the status quo in the worst possible way. At the same time, it strips 2nd edition players of their agency and shared history and confuses new potential Planescape players, and what is critical, GMs, with a possible distorted perspective. Even with the best outcome of in-canon maze amnesty and multiple resurrections, it is hard to see why progressive and ever-changing planers and citizens of Sigil would flock back to personalities who failed their missions and ideologies more than 100 years ago. I would love to be proven wrong, but with all the speculations aside, we have potentially long dead people walking the streets of City of Doors, and factions reassembled with complete disregard for timeline continuity. With this in mind, let us know that the potential reasons Wizards decided to revive old factals is not due to mazes or resurrection spells or reincarnations. Sure, it might be the will of Chronepsis, the dragon god of time, but when we analyze products with a massive lifespan, it's hard to ignore the presence of the hidden enemy of timelines and continuity, the dreaded American copyright law. Every major entity in D&D is a subject of copyright. You don't need to be a legal eagle or active member of Fraternity of Order to get that if those parts of IP aren't used by Wizards, the anarchic public domain might encroach and snare them for itself. For many years in the 5th edition era official interviews, we've heard the phrase, "It's up for a GM to decide," or "We will leave this for you to explore on your own." And at the first glance, it could feel like an egalitarian way to give every storyteller a decent amount of agency and self-governance. It's an approach that can perfectly work for many prime material settings, especially the homebrew original ones. At the same time, with every ambiguous answer, Wizards inadvertently helped to create an even more generic version of their game that is based on impressions from the TV shows or books where the magic system or cosmology works in a drastically different way. But if the same approach would be used in Planescape, with everything that happens behind the curtains of the multiverse, everything in a cosmology can fall apart. In the setting that is responsible for D&D's magic, transportations, belief and alignment system, to approach it with the 5E's traditional ambiguity is a way to dissolve a brand and unravel the planes themselves. But the more we look at the fresh books, it is easy to see that you decide what is true concept is a lie. Despite your own or your players' actions, things are moving on a cosmic scale. The fact that after a decade of 5E's lifespan, we still don't have a proper manual of planes show how deeply the legacy of the 4th edition is affecting Wizards' design decisions today. Without anything set in stone, one can only build hypotheses for a possible hidden 5e metaplot. But if we do that together, the speculative bigger picture across the multiverse that so many of us crave to grasp looks quite alarming. 3 editions ago, With the exception of more unique transitive planes, the only way to get to the outer planes was via a portal, and each portal, technically, was a pathway through the astral plane. To reach inner planes, you were supposed to pass through the border ethereal and into a deep ethereal, and then to an elemental, para-elemental, or quasi-elemental plane. Despite the lack of proper lore in the current edition, in classic Spelljammer cosmology that represented how prime material plane is connected to itself, to get from one world to another, you'd use a flying ship with a magical throw and direct it up and forward until your world's solar system won't terminate with a border of a wall of dark crystal in which each system was encased in. You were supposed to either dive into a rare star-looking orifice on that crystal sphere's surface to get out, or to dissolve a temporary way through it with a powerful magical spell. On the outside of those crystal spheres, there was a mysterious radiant rainbow-colored substance called phlogiston. It flowed like a tide or a bloodstream running from one sphere to another. And if your system's disposition was favorable for that kind of astro navigation, your ship could use it to traverse rainbow rivers using mysterious navigational buoys to emerge at another dark sphere days, weeks, or even months later. Lore informed us gods feared phlogiston, and all priests with divine magic lost their connection to the deities as well, as long as they sailed between the spheres. A huge plot point of Vadoni Emperor Volcaran from the original Spelljammer adventure Under the Dark Fist was built upon a concept of godlike creatures fearing phlogiston and enigmatic dark crystal spheres. It was also said that Ao, so-called over-deity of Forgotten Realms setting, is capable of changing everything within his domain of realm space's crystal shell. While I was confused to find phlogiston never mentioned in the 5e Spelljammer box set, it was interesting to see that the spheres were still there. We must remember that the astral plane is a transitive plane and therefore cannot be completely material. It overlaps material reality but not merges with it. You see, with a whole confusion of new astral, where writers were not sure what are they referencing to, wild space, astral sea, or the astral plane itself, it became evident that they were not sure if there was a need to specify what they are talking about. Once again, intentional ambiguity leads to a narrative gap without helping anyone to navigate it, figuratively or literally. Since classic Planescape was built upon the concept of balance, we can envision some of the rising cosmological analogies with how the second edition's ethereal plane worked. If the hypothesis is true, we can look at the new astral ecosystem as a three-layered construct, with wild space being an actual physical vacuum of space outside of planets and worlds of material plane. Then astral sea would be the borderline space where material and astral are merging, An astral plane would be the pure, undiluted astral, with conduits, colossal bodies of dead gods, and everything that got there by accident. Spelljammer 5e box set states that to get to the astral plane, you just need to sail away from your world for long enough and you'll see how reality starts to bend and change. No portals, no need for astral projection spells, just a quick dash on a ship and your itinerary is done. And yet you can find that adventure, that light of the Xerxes, in chapter about Doom Space, mentioned a shattered crystal sphere, powerless gods, and some remnants of the old lore. With changes that editions bring, it's easy to see how without some transitional barriers of the past, Astral would be relatively overcrowded with Spelljammer traffic, material debris, and new opportunities. The Athar faction originally held Astral as their plane of influence to study and mock the dead gods. Now it seems like they're partially in control of the most lucrative and vibrant commercial avenue since the City of Brass. While we do not know exactly how the new inner planes behave, it is crucial for us to remember that original seats of power of the Doomguard faction were represented by 5 citadels on quasi-elemental planes of dust, salt, vacuum, and ash. One of those citadel was the legendary Citadel Cavitius, the great skull-looking maze of arcane mysteries, and later, the domain of the Lord of Secrets himself, Vecna. With negative energy planes' collapse into the elemental chaos, Anthropic scholars of Doomguard will need to start their observations anew, alongside with creating a whole new task force to explore and monitor ongoing Shadowfell activities. The corresponding positive energy plane collapse resulted in a cosmic shift that helped to realign Feywild's multiversal position, reinforcing starved connections and invigorating them with a long-forgotten ardor. Something so primal and powerful presumably will result in a huge spike in wildlife population numbers and massive resurgence of plant life. Therefore, countless new petitioners arising amidst the wilderness of beastlands. Potential faunal collapse could be a result of this inflation of traffic to the gate town. Initially, the faction of the Sign of One held its domain here, but after the faction war, it seems like this plane once again become an unclaimed wilderness. With a step aside from cosmology, I would also focus for a moment on the obvious merit of genderless language in some updated faction names. In the multiverse full of creatures who can represent a spectacular gender diversity spectrum, you're doing good job, factions. With all that in mind, let's get back to the cosmological tips and clues we've gathered from previous 5e books that underline the idea of present and moving metaplot. Let us try and find some glimpses of the future in the past. Everyone in the last 2 to 3 years realized that time does not exist anymore due to the effects of pandemic and isolation. But only folks who've read Bruce Cordell's Guide to the Ethereal Plane realize that time in D&D Multiverse is a tangible material, as tangible as Archon's Radiance, Purified Pain, or Fire Method's Sweat. At least 123 years ago, a demiplane of time existed in the deep ethereal and opened up some mind-boggling possibilities for planewalkers fearless enough to enter it. It would be great to know how balance changed within the ethereal plane itself, but the only 5e book officially set there, the one about the Radiant Citadel, decided not to share any details about the plane whatsoever. All in all, with such a great amount of timelines and potential possibilities disturbed, we would like to know how everything works in the ethereal plane in this century. If you've encountered the official cover art for the Wheel of Fortune adventure book, then you have seen that behind the jackal-headed Shemeshka, our Prince of Crosstrade, there's a huge skull. One could assume it's a head of a lich or maybe a mimir, a peculiar skull-looking floating portable library. But since the main mimir from that adventure has a distinguished mosaic design, there is a dreadful chance that due to blurred details and toned down hues, we see a depiction of Citadel Cavitius. Once an ancient remnant of power within the ethereal plane, then the Citadel of the Doomguard faction that was stolen by none other than Vecna. After the 2nd edition adventure Die Vecna Die, we can assume that the copy of the Citadel in the Demiplane of Dread was destroyed or left to rot in the aftermath of the newborn deity's escape. But the original Citadel has to be stashed somewhere in the multiverse still. If that is indeed a Vecnian seat of power, why is it depicted rising amidst the Outlands? Some strange plan hatched in the proximity of the spire to shield the greatest necromancer from the deities? We do not know yet, and all this looks like a solid piece of foreshadowing. What else in this release leads to Vecna? There is a possible singular mention that he is coming by a potential adversary, but that's it. Looks like nothing else aside from intentional hype around his persona in a cross-media space and a specific glorious visual redesign. Or is it? Let's take a look at how the multiversal glitch is orchestrated. The metaphysical methodology is based upon belief, just like almost everything around the Outer Planes. It is said that a certain fiend was tasked to deliberately shift order out of balance in the planar realms. The means to achieve that goal will be evident in the adventure, but they certainly are not of the typical abyssal palette of slaughter and mayhem, and too sane to originate in pandemonium. If you disregard the Lord of the Spider's Throne appearance on the hit-streaming show Critical Role and the mention that Hand of Vecna is now canonically in possession of Joe Manganiello's Dragonborn Juggernaut Archon the Cruel, last time players encountered Vecna's activities in Die Vecna Die, adventure spanning an epic apocalyptic tale between the settings of Greyhawk, Ravenloft, and Planescape. Why is this relevant? Book 1 of that adventure focuses on a very specific location, Tovak Baragu, an ancient megalithic structure Builded as a series of concentric arches closely resembling famous Stonehenge or the Nameless One's maze. So what? For those of us who are going to experience Outlands in their full glory for the first time, I must issue a warning that D&D Multiverse originally never was a gallery of bizarro-type characters that the upcoming multiversal glitch from Wheel of Fortune may turn it into. The multi part was addressed to the infinite amount of prime material worlds, from canonized Faerun and Kryn, Arthas and Orth, Mystara and Blackmoor, and to infinite amount of homebrew campaigns. All of them shared a unified magic system, and each alteration to it was a reflection of the specific restrictions inside a particular crystal shell, presumably imposed by a local overdeity. Like gunpowder not working in Greyhawk, or the whole way how magic in Dark Sun setting functions the way it does was due to Athas's Grey isolating the ethereal plane, since transitive planes like astral and ethereal overlapped every material world. Back in the day, we were assuming these worlds, planets or other objects in wild space, with the exception of Keith Baker's Eberron, shared the same layout of outer and inner planes starting right after the threshold of Border Ethereal. That meant adventurers from Baldur's Gate, defenders of Palanthas, or explorers of Castle Greyhawk fought demons from the same abyss, defended ideals of the same seven heavens, or were thrown in the same negative energy plane by a tired dungeon master. Multiverse was a labyrinth of infinite amount material worlds within a prime material plane, connected to the finite amount of infinite in size outer and inner planes by a finite amount of transitive planes. Are you still with me? Good. What's Tovak Baragu have to do with any of it? As far as we know, it was one of sites linked to Moxlick, better known as the Serpent. It's the only canon location I can recall that allowed entities that traverse it to cross to the pieces of alternative material planes that were physical, tangible, real. It was intentionally stated in the book that what players experience there is not a demiplane within the ethereal. Those were not the figments built from belief or philosophy like the outer planes, nor filled with potential building blocks of multiverse like the inner planes, the actual bizarro worlds, where climate, denizens, tectonics and ocean levels drastically change from one another. Were those the worlds of enigmatic keepers or remnants of the first world that dragons sing about? By walking through at least 5 portal arches in Tovak Baragu, cultists of Vecna were able to reach the inner sanctum of his clergy. That shows us that the Whispered One was exploring the more broadly media-represented side of the multiverse quite a long time ago. So if that is his potential modus operandi, and his hidden in plain sight headquarters on the adventure book, there's a big chance we will encounter Vecna soon once again. But why now? Is it because the Doomguard were right all along, and the multiverse is in a crucial condition? Is it a result of generations of adventurers purposely ignoring greater effects of their alignments? With energy planes collapsing out of the previously defined order into elemental chaos, and cults of Tharizdun on the rise worshipping the elemental evil, while death, decay and sheer horror amongst the material plane is generated by both Xoxian imperialistic scumbags and whatever those far realm infused obelisks are doing, yeah, we can assume law and order can feel a bit shaky. So, does intense fighting on Avernus instead of grey wastes of Hades indicate that Blood War is not going so well for Bartezu? At the moment, as far as we can see by indirect evidence, the overall amount of chaos in the outer planes is on the rise. So, if the ancient myth claiming that Asmodeus by some supernatural ties linked with the serpent who communicates with Vecna, can we assume that the multiversal glitch was a side effect of a bigger cosmic level conspiracy in action? Just as I've said before, all you've just heard is pure speculation, mainly based on 12 images and pre-established bits and pieces of traditional multiversal lore going decades in real life past. It can turn out to be true, it can be a missed shot, but this whole mental exercise is here to demonstrate to you how clearly defined narrative rules and connections can work if a storyteller does not rely on dangerous and sometimes uncreative ambiguity. As a almost lifelong fan of the Planescape setting, I can only ask Wizards for one thing: leave all ambiguity for the Lady of Pain. Problems that plagued this edition's Spelljammer release can be avoided with new Planescape by delivering a fundamental base for the re-established laws of the multiverse to make first steps forward into making something your own. We need to know what is a modern legacy of Dungeons and Dragons. Thank you for your time, and remember to question everything.